to be here this evening. I want to thank the Historical Society and Megan for inviting me to come. I want to thank, before I forget it, I want to thank Matthew Armstrong for the extraordinary help he has given me over the last month in particular. And also I want to thank Bob, Debbie, and Charles in the Historical Society Library for the help that they've given me over the past several years. Some of the slides you'll see are a result of that help. Now, in preparing this, I'm going to speak to you as an architect, and I want to talk to you about why people come to St. Augustine that maybe doesn't have a direct relationship to history as far as they're concerned. It does have a relationship. But the point is that they enjoy St. Augustine and they come back and they don't really understand why. I would like to discuss that a little bit. There is a presence here that we still have due to the hard work of many people over many years. So let's begin. The illustration you see at the top of the introductory slide is one way of imaging St. Augustine. I won't discuss it right now. I'll come back to it in a minute. We'll talk a little bit about some more images that are similar. I think it's only fitting to show you a picture of the interior of the oldest house, since we're celebrating our 100th anniversary. Notice that it's very different from what you see today. When you look at it today, it looks as if it's deteriorated. And of course, that's what restoration does to us. But here it was in 1918, soon after it was acquired by the Historical Society. The anchor of St. Augustine for everybody who visits here, I think, at one time or another, has to be the Castillo. A lot of people look at the Castillo as an authentic way of touching Spanish history here. A lot of visitors are aware of that, and a lot aren't. It's just fun to walk through the fort. And we look at it and we think, look what those Spanish did. But we don't see the fort as the Spanish saw it. We see the fort in its ruined state, as a matter of fact. If you read Albert Malussy's book, you'll find that nobody, the Spanish, the British, nor the American territorials, would ever have left the coquina exposed to view. Coquina was not a beautiful material to them. They appreciated it for its beauty, but the reason they used it had utilitarian value, and they had to protect it from the weather, and the way you protect it is you cover it up. Whoop. I'll get used to this thing in a minute. What if the fort were restored to its Spanish condition? What would your reaction be if you imagine this as it appeared? A great white geometric symbol of Spanish authority in the middle of the piney woods. That's really what it was, as well as the defensive work, but we don't see it that way today. Our image of the fort is different. Our images of St. Augustine change. What would happen if this old wall on Avila Street were plastered? What happens to the patina of age when we cover a material up to properly protect it? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered here in St. Augustine, and my purpose tonight is to ask some of those questions, certainly not to answer them. But here is one of the things that need to be addressed. Is there a way to protect the coquina without covering it up where it can't be seen? Well, perhaps we can find out. Now, the basis of St. Augustine is the city plan. And the city plan is a very special work. The city was laid out according to Spanish ordinances that were fabricated specially for the New World, part of the growing influence of the Renaissance on the Spanish. What they wanted to do was to impose order on the natural world and to express their domination. They also wanted to establish colonies that could be protected. And so the plan of St. Augustine, in accordance with the ordinances, starts at the plaza. Around the plaza are buildings in which merchants are located and some of the Spanish officials. At the top of the slide, at the plaza there, you'll see the Spanish governor's palace. It was located there. The church was always located close to the plaza. In this case, it's shown in the middle of the plaza. And the roads radiated out from the plaza to connect with other Spanish communities. You can see St. George Street radiating to the right from the top of the plaza. And notice that the buildings are all placed right on the street. The front of the buildings is on the front property line. There are no front yards, and all of the properties are fenced. After all, if you live in town in those days, you're going to have some domestic animals. You're going to want to raise some fruit trees. You need a well for yourself. You need a well for the animals. So the backyard was always something very valuable, and it was fenced in, always. Let's talk about that fence. On the street, next to the house, well, let me give you, these are just some examples of streets in Spain where the streets are corridors where you cannot see into the adjacent buildings. There is a distinct separation of public and private space. The home in Spanish culture at that time was a place of refuge. If the young ladies in the family reached the age of puberty, they disappeared from public view. They stayed in the house. They were protected. Here's another view in Toledo, Spain. The narrow streets, great for protection, militarily. The influence of some of these streets comes all the way down from the Romans and their military planning. Here is a typical lot for a peon that originally was created off of St. George Street. Notice the little house over there labeled A on the right side is right on the property line. There is a fence. Usually the fence always on the property line and the street was made of masonry, but not always. Couldn't see through it. It had a gate, the lower part of the slide here, through which guests would enter. You did not enter the normal Spanish house through the front door off of the street. This particular house does have a door to the street because the guy that lived here raised corn. He was a soldier, and he had to supplement his income. So he devoted the rear part of his plot to raising corn to sell. So he would allow people who wanted to buy the corn to come just inside the door and make a purchase. But if someone came to visit, they had to come in through the gate in the side yard. If they were checked out and found to be acceptable, they could go in the home and meet the family. Otherwise, they stopped there. A very strict separation of the family from the public. And that is echoed in the architecture of St. Augustine. These two doors, I'm sure that many of them will recognize them, are on St. George Street. And they are symbolic of whom the plan was made for. And this is what is so important for people who want to come back and enjoy St. Augustine. St. Augustine was designed for the human being, for the person, and it was designed for the horse. The small door is for the person, the bigger door is for the horse, or maybe the ox. No carriages. Maybe some of the wealthy people had carriages. No rolling vehicles on the streets. The narrow streets would not permit it, and the economics would not permit it. So, the plan of St. Augustine was designed really for the person, not for mechanical objects that moved. The automobile and even the horse-drawn carriage is the enemy of the original plan of St. Augustine. We see the rehas on the streets in St. Augustine. These were protected by very dense grills. A lot of the grills that we see are much more open than they would have been originally. The women of the house could sit on the projecting seat at the bottom of the reha and talk to their friends. All talk, no touch. And then the other windows that opened to the gardens that were fenced in had grillages that also were very dense. That was against pirates, against the English, against the French. The home itself was a place of refuge. We need to remember that. It's interesting when you read the statements that were made by the Preservation Board that were based on some of the comments of John Bartram when he visited St. Augustine. And he described it as being so beautiful that there were festivities. You could look through gates and see gardens. And the Preservation Board picked up on that in their planning. But that is not really the correct vision of St. Augustine. They did not really imagine the hardships and the fear that existed from day to day in Spanish St. Augustine. All of the doors on the houses in the first Spanish period opened inward. There was no glass in the windows. There were wooden shutters. They opened inward. And the reason they opened inward is because they could be barred against intruders. And the intruders could not reach the hardware that suspended those doors and windows. Now, when we walk through St. Augustine today, we see some of the original first Spanish period buildings, but we do not see them as the Spanish saw them. What we see today when we walk through St. Augustine is a British or an American territorial or just an American building. We do not see St. Augustine physically as the Spanish saw it in terms of the buildings, not in terms of the buildings. Now, this drawing at the top is a map drawn by de Solis in 1762, right at the end of the first Spanish period. And the map below it was drawn by a Spanish engineer, Roque, in 1788, after the Spanish came back. There is a 26-year interval between these maps, and during that time, the British occupied St. Augustine. Now, we think that the British came and made changes, and they did. They made changes to the buildings. What did they do? First, they brought water-powered sawmills. They introduced technology to St. Augustine. They established plantations up and down the east coast of Florida. The British, unlike the Spanish, wanted to colonize Florida and prepare materials to send back to England as part of the growing industrial revolution there. Very different attitude. The English were a much more open society than the Spanish. They brought from New York a prefabricated barracks building. It was originally constructed down where the National Cemetery is now, south of the National Guard complex. Didn't last very long because the materials were not well suited to the Florida climate. It lasted for a few years into the second Spanish period and then disappeared. The British built one masonry building, complete masonry building of their own design, which remains. The Spanish Bakery. It's down on Marine Street. You can see it today. More importantly than what they built, they changed the Spanish buildings that they occupied. They brought glazed windows. They took the Spanish wooden shutters out of the openings and put in windows, and put the shutters on the outside of the windows. In British society, there was no need to use the building as a place of refuge. The society was more open. You could come in the front door off the street and meet the people inside. A completely different cultural approach to living in St. Augustine. So the buildings were changed. Fireplaces were introduced by the British. And here you can see a floor, a wooden floor that was installed over the Spanish tabby floors. And you see a wooden ceiling covered up the beams in some of the early Spanish homes. So there were more than cosmetic changes to buildings brought by the British. And during the British period, the Menorcans came up from New Smyrna, and they in turn built some structures that were not really in accordance to this original Spanish plan, because as you can see here, the building is pulled back, as the British would do with their new buildings, from the street line. There's space around the building. You can see into it. You have access to it. It's the type of house that we would expect, probably as Americans, to see today. Now, when the Spanish came back after the British left, they made some additional changes during the second Spanish period. But essentially, they did not change the plan that had been originated in the first Spanish period. Here, the cathedral was moved out of the plaza and built by the engineer Roque. We see it here on the north side of the plaza. A number of small buildings were constructed during the second Spanish period. One of the things that we don't know is how much did the presence of the English in St. Augustine influence the design of these buildings that were constructed during the second Spanish period. Here's one of them, the Juanita House on Treasury Street. And here's another one, the oldest house, right? This is the Paredes Dodge House on St. George Street. It's now the glass shop there. And as you can see, during the second Spanish period and later, actually, during the American territorial period, they had an idea about which buildings were the oldest, but there was not an academic approach to really going back into the records, which actually they didn't have great access to, So there were several oldest houses. This was one of them. At this time, the Spanish governor's house was remodeled by a famous American architect. And here you can see what it looked like in the 1830s. The Spanish governor's house was changed into a customs house and post office. This was done by Robert Mills, who also designed the Washington Monument in Washington. Now we're in the American territorial period. And this is when the urban landscape begins to change, when the original plan of the Spanish begins to be affected. Here is one of the first big hotels, 1835, really at the beginning of the Second Seminole War. There was a lot of tourist activity, a lot of government activity because of the Seminole Wars. So this building was built on Treasury Street. The street running off to the right is Treasury Street, and St. George is here to the left. Here is a Sanborn insurance map. This is this hotel right here. Now, look up on St. George Street and you'll see the beginnings of another early hotel, the Magnolia House. Magnolia House was quite popular, very famous. In fact, Flagler stayed there for a while. Here's what it looked like. Now tell me, these two hotels that we've seen so far, what do they have to do with Spanish history? What do they have to do with St. Augustine as an ancient city? They have nothing to do with that. These are Victorian buildings built for income in a tourist resort. That's what they are. They're huge. Look at that. It's at least 4 stories high. Now, here's the third hotel. You can tell where it was. Here's the plaza in the foreground. There's the market. This is the hotel that reached all the way on the left from the cathedral right up to the waterfront. Big wooden hotel. Can you imagine what St. Augustine was like when that hotel existed? That's what that corner looks like today. Now here's another, the last of the really biggies that really have nothing to do with St. Augustine history. This is the San Marco Hotel. This was located just west of the Huguenot Cemetery, where the Visitor Information Center is today. It towered up in that space and above the Castillo, really. Had nothing to do with St. Augustine as the Spanish colony. And in this slide, in the background at the end of Cordova, you can see the San Marco Hotel standing up, towering above the surrounding area. But of course, also in this slide, you can tell that Flagler has come to town. And Mr. Flagler changed St. Augustine in many ways. For the first time, he built a hotel that addressed the history of St. Augustine. It was not a copy of a building in Spain that is a legitimate, complete copy of some kind. It was an imaginative study of Moorish and Spanish Renaissance architecture, a magnificent building. Not only, though, was it magnificent, it created an urban space that is a modern urban space, a 20th century urban space, surrounded by huge buildings. And you at first say, that's awful. That destroys St. Augustine. No, it was outside of the colonial city. And what it provided was a contrast of scale to the visitor of St. Augustine. It is extraordinary to walk from the Spanish Plaza and St. George Street into this plaza and the buildings that surround it. Completely different. The contrast enhances the Flagler structures, and it enhances the colonial city and St. George Street. I suggest to you that there's a duality here that's very important. Flagler's buildings are as important to understanding St. Augustine as a work of architecture as the Spanish plan is. It is an integral part of St. Augustine today. It's become part of our memories, part of the way we imagine St. Augustine. Look at this luxurious hotel. Nothing like this on St. George Street. The people here had never seen such luxury before. And look at the space. This great urban plaza. It would accept the carriage, large enough to accept the automobile, part of the locomotive age. Here we get a modern hotel that addresses its relationship to the colonial town. Now, about this time, a lot of people become interested in stylistic architecture, Spanish revival, things of that nature. They become interested in the materials in St. Augustine because they're beautiful. Coquina is gorgeous. Here's the De Mesa house before it was restored. The owner of the De Mesa house should have known better. He was a famous engineer, Greville Bath. But he decided that it was important to restore the De Mesa house into a Spanish inn. He imagined a Spanish inn. That's what should be here. And the house next door to it, just beyond, that's now the Greek shrine. That's the Avero house. The owner of it at that time, this is in the 1950s, 60s, decided that this should be a Spanish wealthy person's home. And plans were actually prepared in Seville to make this house into that as they imagined it ought to be. This is not historic preservation. This is creative architecture, period architecture. At the same time, when all of this was happening, suddenly we get the results of the work of the people of St. Augustine that really dates back before 1900. In the 1930s, as I'm sure you all know, the effort was started to get the Carnegie Institute involved, to get historic research created, to get archaeology started for the first time really in St. Augustine. Well, nothing came of that, even though the research was completed by Verne Chatelain, a very famous book, The Defenses of St. Augustine. But nothing came of it until after the Second World War. And then the Preservation Board was created. 1960 saw the issue of the restoration of St. Augustine guidebook by the Preservation Board. Now, what the Preservation Board was intending to do to St. Augustine is probably one of the most radical ideas in urban renewal that has ever hit this country. What they really intended to do was to acquire over time all of the property that existed within the colonial city. And what they were going to do is demolish all structures initially that were not from the first Spanish or British periods. And if there were people who owned homes, those people would be encouraged to allow the board to restore, that is to say, alter their buildings to the proper period if they would give them life tenancy then the property would become the property of the board. Now, this is stuff that's similar to some of the things that were happening or had happened in Williamsburg. And the relationship of what happened at Williamsburg and what happened at the Preservation Board in St. Augustine, those things deserve some very careful study. Very interesting. But the board here had a fatal flaw. In Williamsburg, the foundation is a private entity funded by Rockefeller. In St. Augustine, it was necessary to create a board that was a state board, and therefore all of its actions were subject to public scrutiny. Let me show you some of the things that happened. Here's Williamsburg at the top to give you an idea to compare these two projects. And here is, again, the Roquet map of St. Augustine at the bottom. At the top, these are approximately the same scale. The historic area in Williamsburg is about the same length as from the plaza here in St. Augustine down St. George Street to the Visitor Center. About a mile, a little bit less than a mile. That's the main part of Williamsburg. Williamsburg plan is very different because the central street, Gloucester Street, is 99 feet wide. It's not designed for the person or the horse. It's designed for the carriage. Completely different. English society is much more open than Spanish society. So there are profound differences in the plan of Williamsburg compared to St. Augustine. Very important difference. You can see that the density of the buildings is about the same, except in Williamsburg there were 88 original structures that had survived from earliest times. In St. Augustine, we've ended up with maybe a little more than 30. And those are all encapsulated, those pieces are encapsulated in other structures. Well, this is not going to be a discussion of the Preservation Board, except to say that they were geared to failure, unfortunately, from day one. This scheme of taking over St. Augustine, here's one of the reasons they failed. Believe it or not, this is an assessment map that was part of the original plan of St. Augustine, with the assessed values of all the property there for everyone to see. And everybody knew that the board was going to try and acquire this property. Can you imagine the dollar signs that appeared in people's eyes when they got a wind of what was intended here? Well, in any event, this gives you some idea of the properties that were going to be restored and some that were going to be reconstructed in this original plan. You can see the density is not great. They were going to start at the north end of the city and work south, acquiring property. Here's the plaza area. Here's the area south of the plaza. Not very many buildings here, so not very dense, this original plan. And here is a picture of this incredible model that was built of what they intended to do to St. Augustine. At the top, you can see members of the board surrounding the model, and there's this little article below that's kind of disturbing. It says, there was a discussion about whether the restoration was going to involve expressing antiquity or authenticity. Well, you know, if you're in historic preservation today, your eyes kind of light up and you say, wow, this was going to be an adventure for those guys. Well, indeed it was. Here are pictures of the model. There's the fort in the background. The model was built of St. Augustine north of Hippolyta. And here you can see evidence of the plan. They recognize the value of the plan, the original plan of St. Augustine. Everything is fenced in. Everything. This is what had happened by 1971. These are the properties that had been acquired by the board. And the problem was, of course, that they could never acquire a critical mass to create a museum where you could enter these restored and reconstructed first Spanish period buildings from the street, because they couldn't ever acquire ownership of the public streets. To allow them to create an enclosed museum where you could get the kind of control and access to get a truly great museum going. Never happened. It's interesting now that's a very different approach than Williamsburg, and I'm not going to dwell on this, but in Williamsburg today, you have access to Williamsburg as a private citizen. You can go anywhere you want to. You can park and walk through Williamsburg. You have to pay to get access to individual properties or for tours. Very different from trying to create an enclave in which the historic properties are located. Anyhow, the reason I'm bringing this up is that over the next few years, as PISA, Preservation Institute St. Augustine, continues, investigation of the activities of the board is something that really needs to be done. You could write several books about the activities of the board. It hasn't been done yet. Matt Armstrong is making great efforts to get the information together. There were some other efforts while all of this was going on to make some other changes in St. Augustine. Here's a plan presented by Bill Hall. I'm sure that many of you know Bill. This was the idea, to take some of the state-owned properties that were parking lots up at the north end of St. George Street and Spanish Street, and make an entrance for the different centuries into the restored area from there. Here's a little sketch he provided to show what he thought it would look like. Well, of course, nothing ever came of that. The most serious effort, outside of the Preservation Board's effort, was to reconstruct St. Augustine as it appeared in the year 1580 on property out by the old Ponstelian Motel. And the plans for this were actually prepared, but nothing came of it because there was a gas shortage in the 1980s. So Mr. Lewis and his foundation, who was in charge of this, abandoned the scheme. Now, let's go back to St. Augustine for just a second. The problem with the plan, the original plan of St. Augustine, and its great gift to St. Augustine, is the fact that it controls the way you get into property, and it is related to you, the individual person. A small scale. The widest street in St. Augustine is a little over 20 feet. And that's why you keep coming back to St. Augustine, even if you're not familiar with its history. It's just a great place to be because the buildings relate to you. Automobile is the enemy, though. What are we going to do? Let people rent horses and drive and restore the city properly? Well, you know, that's ridiculous. But the truth is that the ambiance still exists from the first Spanish period in St. Augustine, in the width of the streets, in the continuous walls, in looking through open doors and seeing what's beyond. You can still feel the separation of public and private space. But as an interim solution to this problem, in the Colonial Quarter Museum, recently, part of it has been opened up to the public, where you can walk in and see the buildings. The buildings have become retail trade buildings to help support the activities of the museum. Here's looking through one of the walls. That's what you see beyond. It draws you in the modern need for merchants to merchandise and allow you to see What you're going to get is what's being experimented with here. And this is one of the buildings on St. George Street today that is, as you know, a restaurant and is beginning to sustain the cost of maintaining these buildings. The buildings are still individually interpreted. Now, the main point of this, and I'm ending now, is that we're surrounded by the ambiance of early St. Augustine, by the plan that was created according to the Code of the Indies. We are not conscious of it because the buildings that we see are not of that period. The buildings that were of that period that have survived have been encapsulated in later structures. But we still enjoy the city because it was built for the human being. And that's why people come back. They may know nothing of its history, but the scale is proper, and that has got to be preserved. Now, I'm going to go back to the beginning. We all have personal memories, some of which probably ought to be forgotten. But we all remember having fun in St. Augustine, right? Now, this building, built by the Menorcans, now reconstructed, originally was the site of a building probably built around 1900. I'm not sure. Haven't confirmed the date. This is a personal memory. In that building, here it is. This is what that little Menorcan building looked like. In this building was a shop called the Overfort Gallery. And the reason it was called the Overfort Gallery is because the owner felt it should be named that instead of the Fork Over Gallery because it would offend the tourists when they visited. Now, the guy that was in here, you see him behind the counter back here, he was a kind of a grungy old guy. He was not really friendly very often, but occasionally he would break down and show you his paintings, which were in the room off to the right here. And they were paintings of Florida and the North, all over the country. Primitives, basic colors. How about this? Imaginary Harbor, St. Augustine. Now, here's one way to imagine St. Augustine. This guy, his name was Earl Cunningham. He's a very important primitive artist in the United States today. His work hangs in some of the most prominent museums, and a book several years ago was written about him. There is no record of him now here in St. Augustine. My point is, there's something else that we have to be very careful about. When earlier on I talked about covering up the patina of history with plaster. Well, when we demolish a structure, we're taking away the patina of history. We need to really examine these buildings that we are demolishing because they are part of an important part of St. Augustine's history. This guy, there should be some record of Mr. Cunningham here, and I'm sure that someday there will be, and for many others like him. That work has yet to be done. That's the end of my lecture.